survey the wondrous
Test. You're live.
How do you turn it off? Carrie, what's the matter with you? I've heard being in front of the class, but that's ridiculous. Do what? I'm going to move on. I got to move this thing because I cannot see my. There. Can you see, Sherry? Can you hear? We got one determined balcony disciple, and she's decided she loves the balcony. You can't hear me either? Now, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Sherry, can you hear me? Can anybody in the back row hear me? Raise your hand. Back row can't hear. Huh? Oh goodness, I've got it up my mouth now. Is there a volume control? Have you got the volume control on? But Judy, let me. Now can you hear me? Anybody can? I know it's on. Huh? Oh, it's turned around. Ah. Let me put on my lapel. Now can you hear me now? Anybody in the back row hear me? Ain't nobody can hear me. I can't. What's the matter with it? Me?
Yeah. Honey,
What?
can we not button that top button?
If I got to get it up my right here, right at that button. He said, right there, about right there. Got it? Go sit down. Somebody's going to object. Now, can you hear me on the back row? Can you hear me up there in the balcony? All is good. Thank you for your patience. The classroom that I normally go to doesn't have a teacher today. They're in here with us. So we got a pretty good little class gathered together. I'm not going to carry on with what David Mayfield was doing there in 1 Corinthians. He can pick that up when he gets back, and hopefully that won't be too long. He's healing, but he's slow. So it may be another week or two before he can manage to be back. He's on a walker now. In the meantime, I thought we would start a class on John. Have you ever gotten a letter from somebody you don't know? You can shake your head yes or no. You have? Never? Never got a letter you didn't? You got letters of people you do know? Oh, that's good. Jimmy, can you hear me? Have you ever gotten a letter from somebody that you didn't know?
Not that I can recall.
You ever gotten a letter? If you've never gotten a letter, you don't. I get letters like people I don't know. I mean, not people, but advertisements and stuff, things. I mean, it comes in the mail, you look at it, you call it junk mail. If you wrote a letter, personal letter to somebody in Oklahoma, and they got that letter, you think they'd read it?
I would hope so.
If you got a letter from somebody in Oklahoma, would you read it? If you got a letter from somebody you know, would you read it? Everybody agree with that? What do you know about John? Why would you read his letter? What is it you don't know about John that would keep you from reading that letter? How well do you know the writer of the Epistle of John? How well do you know it? And if he were your personal friend, would you read it any differently than you normally would? It's got historic value. It's been read by millions of people. Why would you read it? Because everybody else reads it? Or because you know the man that wrote it and you really want to hear what he's got to say? There'd be two ways you could read that letter then. One of them with the eye of a friend, or the eye of a stranger, or the eye of a man who is reportedly one of the great apostles of the New Testament era. A historic figure, rather. But not a personal, not a personal letter. It's just a historic figure. So how well do you know this writer, John? I thought before we would study the letter of John, try to get to know him a little bit. Because there's a good bit in the scriptures about John that sometimes we don't put it all together. I thought if we tried to put it together as we read then what he has to say, it may have a different impact upon you. You know what his trade was? Remember what John was? What was John? Fisherman. Fishermen were not considered low class. They were certainly not considered high class. Most of them were considered to be the non-educated in terms of elevating through the school system and having been chosen by a rabbi, which was the ultimate goal of most young Jewish men, to choose a rabbi and be able to go and study at his feet. But many of the apostles didn't have that privilege of sitting at a rabbi's feet, and it was interesting that the greatest rabbi that ever lived, and he was Jesus, and he picked fishermen as his first disciples. Yes, sir.
Why did Christ choose so many fishermen?
Why did he?
Why did Christ choose so many fishermen?
Yeah, maybe we'll take a look at that. Because they were not considered high class. They were not considered those of influence. They were men who worked hard, and they could survive, and they could raise a family, but it was hard times most of the time. He grew up in Bethsaida. It's an interesting little town. During the period of, before the Maccabees, which was around 200 years before Christ, Greece had pretty much had control, and the population in Israel had flourished. They were doing good. Many of the Jews were so impressed with this dominance of Greek that they adopted the Grecian philosophies and gods. And there was a man by the name of Maccabees. This was in what's called the dark period. If you ever heard of the dark period, that's between the last prophet and the coming of Christ. There was this period where there was no prophets writing, but there was a lot of events taking place. And Antiochus, who was a prime mover in that part of the region of Greece, was part of that Hellenistic movement, which simply means that they were influencing others to embrace the culture and the philosophy of the Greeks. John was in a town called Bethsaida that was now a really small town because the Maccabees had pushed out the Grecian influence, and there was this real contrast between the hardcore Jewish folks and the people who were called Hellenists, who held on to some of those Grecian gods and philosophies. And you'll see that turn up in Acts with those who were converted to Christianity. The city, I saw a video of the archaeologists digging up the town of Bethsaida, which is just on the northern end of the Mediterranean Sea. It was a fishing port. The waters have receded now. There's earthquakes and what have you. It's changed the topography of that area, but it was a sea. It was right there at the sea where the fishermen would go out and do their daily chores. And there were only about, as I recall, 14, 15 houses. I'm going to have to. I go to the doctor to try to keep my throat from closing up, and they gave me all kinds of medicine. Needless to say, it hadn't worked yet. Huh? Lost. Yeah. So bear with me. I know this is rude, but it helps me. It is estimated that with a small village, maybe 200 people at the most would be in this small village. And the archaeologists have dug up lead weights and hooks and things that the fishermen would use, and they've actually got those artifacts. Hook here, my man. I don't know what I'd do without you. Thank you, buddy. I know this is rude too, but boy, you just have to get used to a rude teacher this morning. And you can teach next week if you want. Okay. So it was a small village, an humble village, not prestigious. Two brothers lived there, James and John were in that area. And of all the places Jesus would go, he would go to a fishing village to choose disciples that would change the world. I find that absolutely amazing. The author of this Gospel, John, was one of those. But he wasn't like the rest of the apostles. Have you ever heard of the Synoptic Gospels? Synoptic. Synoptic's a word that simply means same as, look-alikes. Synoptic. And so when you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're called the Synoptic Gospels because what they did was focus on the teachings of Christ, the events in Christ's life, and a lot of them parallel and tell the same story. And they would talk about the culture, they'd talk about the people involved in the mission of Christ. But John comes along, and he doesn't talk about so much what Christ did, but he talked about who Christ was. And so he was not included in the Synoptic Gospels because of that. Doesn't mean it wasn't true. It just means that he focused more on the essence of God than what Christ actually did. You'll read that John's father was named hang on. Zebedee. The interesting thing about this is that of all the apostles, you see some of their family names. When it comes to James and John, you know their father, but you don't know their mother. You don't know who their mother was. He's not named. Some of the other ones, you get the name of the mother and the father. When you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you'll find the genealogies. Well, with Matthew and Luke write the genealogies all the way back to, in one case, David, in the other case, all the way back to Adam. One says they followed the tree of Mary, and the other one followed the tree of Joseph, which were from the tribe of Judah. And they focused on that lineage. And when you look at John, they skip his mother. She's not mentioned. It's interesting. When you look at different commentators who've researched this, Barnes is one I looked at. I've got a note here. He makes no bones about it. He says John, the writer of this gospel, was the son of Zebedee and Salome. There's no proof to that. It could be very true. There's evidence to say that, yeah, that's probably true. And if that's the case, it gets to be an interesting rollout of a little bit about this man John. Mary had how many sons did Mary have? According to the Bible, she had 5, including Christ. And it says, and she had daughters also. So a pretty good sized family. I'm going to read to you Mark 6, verse 3. Is not this is in Christ's hometown, is this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? And they took offense at Jesus. Because how can Jesus, the Messiah, come from this family? How is that possible? And so they laughed at him, and they took offense at him. In John 19, verse 25, it says that Mary had a sister. Question is, who was this sister? If she had a sister, does that not mean that Christ had an aunt? So there's a connection between this writer, John, and Zebedee, and Christ having a mother who had a sister whose name, by historians, name was Salome. Why is that interesting? Because in Matthew 27:56, this is at the cross. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of James and John. You know who it was? Question mark, question mark. Who's the mother of James and John? Got the mother of James and Joseph, the mother of James and John, the sons of Zebedee. You find that interesting? Remember this. In the epistle that John wrote, he never mentions his name. Never mentions his family. And scholars have debated amongst themselves whether or not it was really John the apostle that wrote John. I absolutely disagree with that. I think John was an apostle of Jesus Christ, and that he was special to Christ. And we'll look at that in a moment. But I'm just trying to introduce you to John, this man, this person, who, if he were here today, I bet would be your best friend. He was that kind of guy, if you will. So you've got this writing and that opens a door of questioning. Look in Mark 15, verse 40. And there were also some women watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger, and Joseph, and Salome. See her name mentioned there? Now this is written by Mark, not John. John never mentioned his mother's name, didn't mention his name. He kept that aside. Why? I don't know. We can speculate, but we don't know. But John was there. Look in Matthew 20, verses 20. Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee, that'd be James and John, came up to him, Jesus, and kneeling down before him, she asked him for something. Do you know what she asked? This woman, unnamed, but the mother of James and John, came to Christ, who were the sons of Zebedee, and said, I have a request. And she knelt down before him. What did she ask for? Can my boys, one sit on the right, one sit on the left? Many would say that that was Salome. I have no reason to doubt that. It's not something you can prove, just like you can't really prove John wrote the letter, but throughout the letter, all he does is refer to himself as whom God loved. As whom God loved. I read something that was written from a man who was analyzing the mothers of the Jewish faith. And this is what he wrote. Jewish mothers generally involves in nagging, overprotecting, manipulative, controlling, smothering, and overbearing. One who persists in interfering in her children's lives after they have become adults. That's not the most complimenting thing you can think about, but it was written from a perspective of how the mothers influenced their children and tried to make them successful and tried to put them in positions where they should succeed. Was this what Salome was trying to do? This mother was certainly trying to do that. According to this writer, that was typical of the age. And she, Salome, traveled with this party. There were a number of women, you see here later, the number of women that followed Jesus from Galilee, and it names 4 or 5 of them. But then at the cross, we find some impelling evidence. In the ministry of Christ, John appears to be among the 3 apostles that Christ gave special attention. Let's look at John and the things that all the apostles didn't participate in. One of them was on the Mount of Transfiguration. Only 3 went. Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee. That's the only ones that Christ took with him when he was transfigured and appeared with Moses and Elijah. And then John was Peter, James, and John, those 3. After Christ had been asked by a priest to come and heal his daughter, Christ was on his way. Got interrupted by a lady with the issue of blood. Situation resolved. He went on. Word came, the daughter's dead. Christ got there. He said, "Why are you wailing? She's not dead, she's asleep." He took Peter, James, and John and the parents, nobody else, in, raised Jairus' daughter. What about the rest of them? Why didn't he do it in front of the crowd? He just took Peter, James, and John. And he said, "Don't tell anybody." Oh, you know, when they walked out and the girl was alive, Christ had said, "Well, she's just asleep." And they laughed at him. But he gave them strict instructions, the Bible says, not to tell this before he went in. Don't tell anybody what's going on in here. Peter, James, and John. At the Last Supper, who was sitting next to Jesus, leaning against his breast? John. Seat of honor. A seat of honor. In Gethsemane, in Matthew 26, Christ in his most somber, serious moment, I would think, in his life. Except for perhaps the amount of where he went to after his baptism to spend time with God and pushed himself even almost to the point of death. This was the next moment. They were in the Gethsemane when he knew they were coming after him. And he left his disciples and he took Peter, James, and John, and they went forward, and he says, "Wait here. My soul is extremely distressed." Peter, James, and John. John 19, verse 25. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother, his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, Mary Magdalene. And when Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved, typical words from John, the disciple. He did that, I think, in the gospel here 5 or 6 times. He mentioned the one who God loved. And the disciple, he says, when Jesus saw his mother there, he and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here's your son." Think about that. There's not another apostle mentioned at the cross. It's John, the writer that we want to get to know. Where were the other apostles? Where was Peter? Where was James? There's no mention. They were found 8 days later in a room, locked up. That's the next time you hear about them. But John, he was so close to the cross. It says the women were afar off in one part, but they were close. His mother and John were close enough to be at the foot of the cross where they could hear, where he could look down and see them and talk to them with his last breaths on earth. John, Mama, this your son. Son, this your mother. It says from that time forward, she went to John's house and lived. What about all his brothers? Where were they? They're not mentioned. He had 4 other brothers. I think that's why he's not considered part of the synoptic gospels. He looked at Christ as though Christ really loved him. So John the Apostle, he wrote about who God was. The rest of the apostles did an amazing job of documenting what God did. And so, with that, we'll start to look at John, what he wrote, why he wrote it, how he wrote it. There were poets, if you will, philosophers, poets. 2 of them, Virgil and Homer, were very good at using the Greek language to pontificate on a number of things, a lot of philosophy. And they would write about perfect gods. And they would talk about Mars, Jupiter, all the Mercury. And they described how perfect they were. And every one of those gods had faults. God, small g, had faults. But with all their poetic might and with all their influence in the culture of that day, with all that they wrote and all the glorious words that they had, where are their gods today? But you take a fisherman from a little village on the north end of the Galilean Sea, and he writes the most beautiful summary of the perfect God. How can that be? How can that be? Uneducated, unqualified in the eyes of man. Huh? The Holy Ghost Jesus Christ breathed on a member in the meeting behind closed doors, and they received the gift of the Spirit. Inspired. And John wrote about things that are true, but things he never saw. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was God. The Word was with God. And all things were made by Him. John, how do you know that? Well, I'd say the Spirit guided him through that. All things were made by Him. Without Him was not anything made that was made. How profound are those words? I will ask you to define for me the first 3 words. What does that mean? In the beginning. The beginning of what? Was God without years? Was He infinity? Beginning of what? In the beginning. What was the beginning? Anybody? I don't know. In the beginning of what? In the beginning of the earth?
Genesis 1:1.
Huh?
Genesis 1:1, in the beginning.
In the beginning. In the beginning of the creation? But in the beginning. Mankind, all the things that God created. What about before that? Do what?
The beginning of this existence.
This existence.
Including time, including location, including things within it.
That's why I moved this thing 3 pews forward so I could hear, and I still can't hear real good. I put a mic on you so I could hear. I really want to hear what you say.
In the beginning of this existence, including the beginning of time, the beginning of
Place.
and the beginning of things within it.
Physical things.
Yes.
Physical things. The beginning of physical things. Is that a summation?
Well, also spiritual things.
Well, did the spiritual part precede the beginning?
Well, did God not also create spiritual beings?
When did He do that? At the beginning or before the beginning? Yeah, exactly. That's where my mind starts to go around. I can't. Even the idea of infinity, God not having a beginning, He just always was. And He always was what? He was always God. But there was a point, and I started to say a point in time, but I'm not sure what time is, because I think that was created at the beginning. Time. For us, time it was governed earlier by the celestial creation, the moon, and the cycles of the moon, and the feasts that were all the pilgrimage feasts, the 3 pilgrimage feasts, were all coordinated by time of the. That was the bell, wasn't it? Sorry. So that was the clock, if you will, back in the beginning. There was a clock. Before that is a mystery that will be revealed to us when the time is right.
Brother David,
Yes, sir.
Psalms chapter 90, verse 2 says, before the mountains were brought forth, or ever thou hast formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting,
Yeah.
thou art God.
From everlasting to everlasting, I have no idea how to get my head around that. And I've quit trying. Because I think it's an impossible task for for a human being who knows nothing but what we see, what we touch, what we feel, the senses that we have. Beyond those senses, like eternity, I just keep grasping, and I can't. So I quit. I just quit because it drives you nuts when you can't figure it out. And it's I'm kind of an engineering spirit myself, and if I can't get my hands around it, I just get frustrated. And I can't get my hands around eternity. I don't know what it is. But that's God. I can't get my hands around him. He's got his hands around me. John says, the disciple that God loved. Are you like John? I suggest you are. You're the disciple that God loved. And loved enough to carry the cross. Via Dolorosa. Via Dolorosa. For you. For me. I would like, the bell rang, didn't it? Twice? Okay, that's it. Thank you for your attention. Very kind. Thank you for your participation, even though I can't hear everything I like to hear. Next week, Lord willing, we'll do first chapter of John. Now you know a little bit about John, a letter that you're from a guy who's your friend.